This is the 52nd episode of the Effective Executive podcast and YouTube channel. And this week I had watched The Profit. I don't know if many of you watch it or not, but with Marcus Lemonis. And I always like to watch these because in smaller organizations, they are microcosms of larger organizations, and you can kind of see how things develop, growing from maybe a 2-person operation to a 1,000-person operation. And you can see some of the things that are in the makings of how people think and how an organization ultimately gets put together. So it reminded me this week of 4 things that executives should do. And this episode that I watched of The Profit was James Gourmet, and it was pies. This was a veteran that made pies, and Marcus Lemonis came in, and this guy's looking for an investment basically for his pies. And as I listened to this episode of The Profit, I just thought, geez, there's a lot of things in here that I see that people can learn from, that executives can learn from, no matter whether you're in a small business or a super large business. And the first thing was that you need to educate yourself. There needs to be some continual improvement that's being done. Now, I've mentioned this before, but there's thousands, literally thousands of people who teach the soft skills of being a leader and those types of things. That's not what I do. I'm more about the hard skills. And I think that these are things that executives need to develop. Things like learn about their industry. There's sometimes conferences, there's learning sessions, there's a whole series of things typically in every industry that can develop your broader thinking about the system that you're operating in and in your particular industry. And I think those are all good things. Now, James, the owner of James Gourmet, his focus was he wanted to be a businessman. He didn't want to be a pie maker, as it ultimately came out as you watch this episode. And he really resisted any type of education on the work. He wanted to be involved with fun stuff in his mind. And I see this in coaching and working with executives, is they have a tendency to gravitate, unless they're coached away from it, to the stuff that they only enjoy doing. And so you get better at something you're already good at. Doesn't get you as much as getting better at something that maybe you aren't so good at, and that the business that you're in or the organization that you're in would benefit from. So what was the first takeaway is this concept of continually improve by education as far as an executive goes. And now the second thing was that you need to educate yourself about the business itself. So often you'll see, well, in James' case, let's say in this small business, he needs to learn how to bake, especially in a small business, because there isn't really much more to the work other than making the pies and ultimately selling them. But he needed to understand the business in order to be able to innovate and in order to make things better. But it doesn't matter. In most industries I see, especially with all the flight of executives from one company to another, from one industry to another, there's this mindset that an executive is kind of a plug and play type of a position. That he or she was so successful in this industry, and so let's bring them in, and they'll be able to fix, basically what we're doing. And if they're in another industry, I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I've seen it happen. Sometimes that works, but more often than not, it doesn't work as well, because the person that's being recruited from a different industry comes in with the mindset of I can improve this business based on what I learned in a different industry. And like I said, sometimes that works, but there's usually a lot of hubris involved in that particular mindset. People just want to take what they did in their previous position and put it in, and the flexibility often isn't there to be able to be successful in a different industry. The same thing goes for even if you're in the same industry. When you were in, let's say, a competitor, and that you're recruited into a new business that was a former competitor of yours, oh, they're hiring me because I'm so great and so smart. And again, it's a lot of this is hubris with regards to executives. And so what they bring in is not to learn, but to implement and to execute, because that's what executives do, right? It's even in the name, executives, execute. So, but I think maybe even if we need to come up with a different name or something, but just execution is not what will make your business better. You need to understand the business itself. You need to understand the differences between when you were in the previous organization versus the organization. This is whether you're coming in from a different industry or from a competitor. You need to understand what the differences are between the two businesses. So there's this educational process that you need to go through in order to understand the differences and understand why they do things differently. Different could be because of different customers, different processes, different thought, those types of things. And so the follow-on to that is, in a small business, you can see almost everything. If you were a blacksmith, 200 years ago, then you pretty much saw the whole system. You were the salesperson. You were the person who pounded out the metal that, you saw end to end, and you were able to adjust and do those types of things. But as businesses became less of one person and more of multi-people, a lot of this was lost. And so you can't see it all. And so that becomes one of the first things that I coach executives to do, is to educate themselves on the end-to-end process, because they don't see it. It's just not something that is inherent to what they do. They don't see the entire system. They only, maybe it's a department that they're put over or whatever. And in a 1,000-person organization, to be able to see from the time the customer places an order or submits a complaint all the way through the end is something that is very difficult to see unless you take the time to do it. So this is part of the education program that I coach executives on and executive teams, is to get to look through that customer lens so that they can see the whole of what's going on. The other thing is what I call the thinking lens, and that's to educate yourself on how your organization thinks. Now, I never suggest that people go in, whether it's the customer lens or how the organization thinks, and you say, well, that's all wrong, that type of thing, because you're going to have to be taking a whole group of people in an organization that have that mindset, that have been in that system for a long period of time, and be able to make the changes in that system. And so you need to start from where they are and not from where you are. And going through the process of looking through the thinking lens, especially in learning about how that organization, there's a number of things, but two important ones are how they control things in the organization, how they motivate around those. And those, to me, are the two biggest pieces in an organization that influence how it acts and how it responds to customers and employees and things of that sort. So getting to understand that, because I can guarantee you from the organization you came from, they're not all the same, especially around control and motivation. And sometimes it's difficult to weed out until you start to see the reactions that customers, employees have to deal with on a daily basis, because it's not a conscious thing in many cases. It's not something, there's a rule or a policy or anything like that. There are these, it's the interconnection of the parts, as one might say, that when we're looking at a system and the whole of it, and the interaction of those parts is where a lot of this is won and lost with regards to the success of an executive as well as the organization. So that's what I wanted to cover this week. You have a great Labor Day weekend, and I'll catch you next week.